In this video, we are going to learn how two people can use GitHub to collaborate on a project together. Obviously, you can use GitHub for more than that, more than two people, but we're going to work with just two, Jim Bob and Jane Bob. So Jane Bob has written some code, and she's going to import Jim Bob's code. What I'm doing here is actually showing the code as I want it to be, and then we're going to go through and construct the code using GitHub as a collaboration. What Jane Bob wants to have happen here is she wants to be able to import Jim Bob's file, whatever he sends to her. She's going to run a unit test on this. And what she wants to create is a function that multiplies some number by 3 and then adds 2 to it. Pretty simple stuff. So obviously this is simple enough that you wouldn't really need collaborators to work on. Really wouldn't even need a function to do this, but it's simple enough that it's easy to understand. I don't want the code that I'm writing to get away in the way of learning the lessons on GitHub. So I'm going to keep the code simple. GitHub, well, that'll be complicated enough as it is. Jane Bob is relying on Jim Bob to multiply the x by 3, and then she's going to add 2 to it. But she has requested one specification from Jim Bob. And the specification that she has requested is that if x is not some kind of number, then she wants his function to return none, so that she can check to see if she gets none or not. If she does get a none back from his function, she knows to return none. She knows that she's not working with a number. Otherwise, she can add 2 to whatever is done. So Jim Bob has a little bit of work to do, and he has to do some error checking. Here's what Jim Bob should write without documentation. He should write 3 times. This is supposed to have an underscore in there. That's why I'm being complained at and getting underlines. So we check to see if x is, is a float or a complex or an int. And if it is, then we multiply it by 3. And if it's not, we're going to return none, just as Jane Bob asked. And then Jane Bob is going to run a unit test on this, check Jim Bob's code, and see how it works. Okay, so now we run unit tests, and what? Oh, I changed the name of this. Let's run it again. Run it. There. Whew. I was going to say, I tested this before and it worked. Okay, so as the code's written, works fine. Now what I'm going to do is run you through how Jim Bob and Jane Bob got to this point where we have successfully running code, or a way. So Jane Bob has an idea of what she wants to do. She's written this code. She's written out her unit tests. She knows what must happen in the case of an integer, of a float. She didn't put in a complex number. She could have. She didn't bother to test that. And she also, in the case where a string was input, checked for none. Now we could have more error testing here. We could have tried passing in, say for example, a list or a dictionary to 3 times x plus 2 to make sure we get none back, but keeping that part pretty basic. So this is Jane Bob's code. And she's got this fleshed out already. She knows what she's expecting from Jim Bob. So now we're going to go up as Jane Bob, who's on the Internet Explorer. And this is the demo video repository. I'm going to create a new file. And we'll call this one Jane Bob. You have to put the extension on here. GitHub does not know what programming language you are working with. You can actually kind of tell it. In fact, we're doing .py, so now it is going to know. And it's going to treat different programming languages differently. So in Python, GitHub understands that the way you indicate where you are in a program is by indentation. If you were using a different programming language, for example PHP, where it uses braces for things instead of indentation, it would know that too. Alright, so now I'm going to paste her code in here. Well, it doesn't paste very nicely, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of work here. And I am going to have to put these things all on new lines here. I'm going to pause while I do that. Alright, so the code should look like that. And I've paid a price here because normally you would not cut and paste your code into a file like this. You would do another way to transfer a file up here. That's going to be in the third video, so we're not there yet. We'll do it this way. All right, I'm going to commit a new file, create janebob.py. I should have left that, that's fine. And put a little funny in here. Where's JimBob? And we're going to commit this directly to the master branch. Now, at this point, we have an option of creating another branch, which may actually be a good idea. Now, let's talk a bit now about what branches are. Before we know, I'm just going to commit this directly to the master branch. So branches. Remember, if we go over to graphs, we can look at network. And what we have here is sort of a tree, but this is a pretty boring tree. It's basically just a trunk. And we can see in the last commit that we created janebob.py. Fine. If you wanted to, we could have at any one of these nodes made a new branch down here that it had its own history. So I could create a branch down here. Maybe I could have done it right here when I created, well, actually it would have been here when I created janebob.py. Oh, you caught me. You see that delete janebob.py? I actually made this video once before. I made a mistake and had to come back here. So back here, that's where I'm adding. Here, my goodness. There we go, putting in line breaks. So when I was originally getting ready to create janebob.py, I could have added a branch, which would have brought us down here, and then worked on that branch. Master would have stayed unchanged, did work on that branch, and then when I was done, brought this branch back up to here. Now, why might you do it that way? Well, one reason why that's done is the master branch is often used for the production line of code. So if I want to download some kind of freeware and it's on GitHub, and this is becoming more common, especially if you work with Unix, when you want to program, they'll often say, go to GitHub, pull the code. You're going to the master branch. So as an end user, I go to the master branch, get the code, compile it, run it. But people are contributing all the time to that code. They don't actually contribute directly to the master branch. What generally is done is there's a branch down here called contrib. In fact, I think in a previous video I mentioned that I had done some contributions to a piece of software called WebWork. When I did that, I actually contributed to the branch called contrib. And then there was a guy that keeps charge of the master. He looks at the contributions to contrib and checks them over. He's got some software he runs on contributions to make sure they do what they're supposed to. And if all that passes, then things from contrib go back up to branch back up to the master. Okay, so you may want to create other branches. For this piece of code, that's not what we're going to do. Now, the other thing is that JBob owns this repository. So what we did here is considered to be a push. We pushed a file directly into a branch, the master branch of this repository. Now, we are going to switch over to JBob now, and we're going to do some work from JBob side, which means that I'm going over to Firefox. And now I am JBob. You can see the change in icon, and we have the JBob demo video, and sure enough, I see janebob.py. So I am a direct contributor to this repository. And as a direct contributor, I can just do pushes the same way that JBob does, but that's not the version of this that I want to go through. What I want to do is, instead of acting like a contributor, we are going to create our own version of JBob's repository. We're going to work in our branch of the repository, and then we're going to tell JBob when we're done, and she's going to accept or refuse our requests. So to do that, what we want to do is create a fork of the JBob demo video repository. And when we do this, it puts it on our account. So creating the fork. This is called forking. Comments on that. So notice now that I am in a repository, and notice that it has this forked version here. So we have this symbol up here to let us know that we're not actually working in the Jane Bob demo video version. We are working in the Y for the Love of Mike is Jim Bob Taken demo video version of this repository. Notice they look exactly the same otherwise. We have the same files. Everything else is the same as it should be. So I'm working in exact same things as Jane Bob. It's now listing a fork. If I go up to my profile, now under repositories, I have a repository. It's that demo video. If I go to settings and look at my repositories, there's two repositories now. There's the original Jane Bob demo video. I'm still a collaborator. I still could contribute directly to that, but I also have the forked version. Now what I'm going to do is work on my project in the forked version. Alright, I am going to create a new file. And Jane Bob told me she wanted this called Jim Bob. So I'm going to call it Jim Bob. And I am going to steal the code here from here. Now again, this is not the way you would do this, but I will show you in another video how you might come up with a better way of putting code up. Well, this time it pasted it just fine. Now, when I do this, the first go around, I'm not actually going to do what Jane Bob asked me to. Let me see, make sure I got the right number of spaces here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm just going to return 3 times x, which is going to cause some issues with Jane Bob's code in the case that something is passed in that's not some kind of number. All right, I'm going to save this. And put in a description. And we're committing directly to the master branch. Now in this case, the master branch is on the fork. So we're contributing to the master branch of the fork. We could create branches from this fork. We could fork the fork. That didn't sound right. All right, so we have committed. Excellent. Now I'm looking and I see all this code. What happens if I go over and look at what Jane Bob's got? So if I refresh this, Jane Bob is not seeing Jim Bob's code because she is in her own version of this repository. What I want to do is tell Jane Bob I am done. So go back over to being Jim Bob, and I'm going to create a pull request. Okay, now I want a new pull request, and this is set up nicely for us. So we're going back to the base fork Jane Bob demo video on the master branch, and we are coming from our forked version, the master branch. And let's see, is there anything else I want to do here? I think that's it. So I'm going to create a pull request, and we'll call it create Jim Bob. All right, looks good enough. Create pull request. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. All right, so I came back over to Jane Bob's account, and I did a refresh and noticed that I have a pull request. So I'm going to go to this pull request, and it says create jimbob.py. So we're going to take a look at this. Well, Jim Bob seems to think that his code is awesome. Well, that's great. Well, let's see what he's done. This is the file he's added. Let's take a look at his code. Now, what I could do at this point is take his code, download it, and again, we'll talk about how to do that in another video. Run it through the unit test that I've set up, and what I'm going to find out is it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Well, because Jim Bob hasn't done what we've asked him to. Let's see. We have options here of we can comment, we can approve, and we can request changes. So we're going to submit a review. And we can do this on a line-by-line basis. So I don't have an issue here. I don't have an issue here so much. Well, actually, I do have an issue here. So you can comment on each and every line on this thing. I'm going to write a comment. I'm going to say, you never checked. Oops. To see if X is a number or not, as specified. All right, so now we're starting our review, and we have submitted our review. So now, oh, look at this. So this is Jim Bob's email account, and he just got a message saying, hey, Jane Bob looked at your code. Maybe it's not so awesome as you think. All right, so now we can go back to being Jim Bob. And now we want to look at, let's see, make sure I'm in the right thing. Yeah, okay, I'm Jim Bob. Let's go back to Jim Bob. And what is this over here? We have something, we have a message. Oh, and there it is. This is actually when I came in, this is what I saw, but if I go to my pull requests and I look at my messages, then I get this message, you never check to see if X is our number or not, as specified. So now I'm going to have to make some changes. And what I'm going to do is go back to, now this is the original version of Jane Bob. Notice there's no forked sign here. So I want to get back to go to my profile, go to my oh no, it was right there. Go to my repository, and I'm going to make some changes to Jim Bob. I'm going to edit. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Ooh, we're 18 minutes in. Huh. I should finish this up, eh? All right. Copy this. Paste it here. And say fixed. Commit changes. Get rid of this. And we are going to create a new pull request. And hang on a second. Well, in the interim, my dog found a squirrel, and we took care of that. So no more barking, and I changed my mind. We don't need to create a new pull request. We have an open pull request as it is. Create jimbob.py. So I can leave. So we have a conversation going now. I sent this to Jane Bob saying my code is awesome. Jane Bob replied and said, yeah, maybe not so much. So now I have the ability to leave another comment and say, Jane, I fixed my code. And I will put that up as a comment. And now I'm going to go over and act as Jane. And when I go over and act as Jane, I have this message now that says, Jane, I fixed my code, but I also see a plus sign here that says new changes were made since you viewed this last. So I can go in and view the changes. Now, for more complicated code, I might say, well, you're kidding. I actually managed to screw the code up. I still have the return 3x in there, and I copied the if instance and stuff underneath that. Let's just pretend I didn't do that, and let's pretend that the code is all right. So Jane Bob is viewing the code and says, looks good. Goes back to pull requests. And says, you know what, looks great. Okay, so it's a lie. So that's actually wrong. Comment. Merge pull request. Confirm merge. Done. And now it's merged into the master. Let's go take a look at our graph network. And we see that there was some work done here by Jim Bob. So Jim Bob forked this. He created Jim Bob. It didn't go so well, so we updated Jim Bob, and then we accepted it, and it's back into the master branch. Now again, often this would be done down here on the contribute line for other contributors, and then the person in charge of the repository, when they accepted things, would accept things into contrib, and then they would make a pull request into master and accept it into master. Alright, so there is an intro to how one can use GitHub to collaborate on a project. I think it looks complicated. It is a little bit complicated. It's also pretty awesome because you have this ability to merge these things together. We could have multiple contributors contributing on this line. If somebody else makes a change, I can see that they made a change. I can pull it into my own version, my forked version. We can revert back to previous versions of the software. If somebody is running an old operating system and they need version 1.2, and only version 1.2 works on their operating system, but we are now on version 2.3, they can go get version 1.2, still on GitHub. It's all there. It's really a wonderful system. A little bit clunky at times, but overall, pretty awesome.